All right. So, I had a little break last week with Brother Billy Bryant being with us, and tonight we're going into chapter 24 of the book of Acts. And so, if you remember, as we ended chapter 23 the last time, Paul was got word that there was a plot to have him ambushed and killed. And if you remember, he told his little nephew knew about it, and Paul said, "You've got to go tell the guard." And so when they find out about it, they transferred Paul under the cover of night to Caesarea to keep him from being ambushed from these Jews that had got together and made a pact that they were going to kill Paul. Now, beginning in chapter 24, begin with verse number 1. It says, after 5 days, Ananias the high priest ascended with the elders and with a certain orator named Tertullus, who informed the governor against Paul. And when he was called forth, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, "Seeing that by thee we enjoy great quietness, and that very worthy deeds are done unto this nation by thy providence, we accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness." Makes you want to puke, don't it? He's being so, and so notwithstanding that I be not further tedious unto thee, I pray thee that thou wouldest hear us of thy clemency a few words. For we have found this man a pestilent fellow, and a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, who also have gone about to profane the temple, whom we took and would have judged according to our law. But the chief captain Lysias came upon us, and with great violence took him away out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come unto thee by examining of whom thyself mayest take knowledge of all these things whereof we accuse him. And the Jews also assented, saying these things were so. So, although the Jews were unsuccessful in their plot to kill Paul, they still hope to get a chance to secure his death. So 5 days after Paul arrives, a delegation of Sanhedrin come down to Caesarea to present their case against Paul. And with them comes this orator or a lawyer by the name of Tertullus. He was an attorney that knew both Roman and Jewish law. And since they're in a Roman court, they need somebody that's familiar with the proceedings of that type of a court system. So acting in behalf of Paul's accusers, Tertullus becomes a spokesman, and he begins his speech in the customary way of addressing government officials. And his introductory remarks make up almost half of the speech, trying to gain the favor and get on the good side of Felix. And being overly flattering to Felix hints that he may not have that good a case against Paul as it sounds. So no doubt Luke's readers know of Felix's incompetence and scandalous reputation. He wasn't a good guy. So they recognize Tertullus's opening words for what they are. So after the ingratiating, I'm learning a lot of, when I study, I learn a lot of these new words, then I have to look up and see what they mean. But after this ingratiating, which means sycophantic or excessive degree of flattery, he's putting it on thick, so much so that anybody that is, and Luke makes sure to record it that way, so anybody reading this, Luke's writing will perceive and understand this is all just a bunch of fluffing stuff. So Tertullus states that the Jews' charges against Paul, and he tries to denigrate the apostle on 3 accounts. First of all, Paul's a troublemaker. He's a pestilent fellow. Well, that's a bad word under Roman law, in Roman cities and Roman rule, because Rome didn't like anything that come against Roman government. So they're accusing Paul to be a troublemaker, a messianic revolutionary that excites the Jews and in many places causes insurrection. He's portrayed to be this cause of unrest and riots not only in Palestine but they're accusing him to be a riotous person even in the Roman world among the Jews. So Tertullus, as the spokesman, as the attorney, he creates the impression that Paul is a threat to Roman stability and peace. So they're trying to bring something to get Felix to look and say, hey, this guy's guilty. I've got to do something here. So first, they accuse him of being a troublemaker. Second, verse number 5, they accuse him of being the ringleader of the Nazarene sect. This charge depicts Paul as a leader of a new religion, therefore an illegal religion. The only place in the New Testament followers that Jesus are called Nazarenes. And it was commonly held view that nothing good could come out of, you remember, nothing good can come out of Nazareth. So with contempt, Tertullus designates the Christian movement as the Nazarite sect. That's where the Church of the Nazarene, that's where they get their name. So the first charges have been general, but then now Tertullus is going to make a specific charge. He says that Paul has attempted to desecrate the temple. And this is in reflection, if you remember, that the rumor that Paul brought the Gentile Trophimus into the place, the court of the Israelites, but they saw him with Paul, but they never saw Paul take him. They just assumed that he took him in there. So Tertullus is trying to show that Paul is some kind of a Jewish renegade that's insensitive to Jewish customs and practices. But he fails to mention that the Jews really wanted to lynch their enemy. So he lays the blame for the violence that took place on the Roman commander Lysias. And he was saying, you know, we were just trying to get him into court. We wanted to try him in our courts. And Lysias came with police brutality and took him out of our hands. And, you know, we could have settled this matter. Really what they wanted to do was ambush him and kill him. And Lysias found out about this so that he saves Paul's life. So Tertullus closes his speech with an appeal to Felix to examine the evidence which will prove the truth of the charges. Verse number 8. And the three charges that they have brought against them have strong religious and theological overtones, but they're calculated to make Paul to appear to the governor as a political agitator and a danger to civil order and peace. So they know that the charges, they don't have anything against Paul, but if they can get the Roman government to think that Paul is causing problems against Rome and against the government, then they can get him accused. But Paul, Felix looks at Paul, motions for him in verse number, let's go to verse number 10. Then Paul, after that the governor had beckoned unto him to speak, answered, For as much as I know that you have been many years judge to this nation, I do more cheerfully answer for myself, because that you may understand that there are yet but 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem for to worship. And they neither found me in the temple disputing with any man, neither raising up the people, neither in the synagogues nor in the city. Neither can they prove the things whereof they now accuse me. But this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and the prophets, and have hope toward God, which they themselves also allow, that there shall be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. And herein do I exercise myself to have always a good conscience, void of offense toward God and toward men. Now after many years I came to bring alms to my nation and offerings, whereupon certain Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with multitude nor with tumult, who ought to have been here before thee, and object if they had aught against me. Or else let these same here say, if they have found any evil doing in me while I stood before the council. Except it be for this one voice that I cried standing among them, touching the resurrection of the dead, I am called in question by you this day. So Felix motions to Paul, and he hears Tertullus and hears the accusations, and he turns to Paul, motions with his hands, and he says, okay, Paul, what do you have to say? And Paul conducts his own defense, and point by point he is wanting to try to convince Felix that he's innocent of all these political charges, these made-up issues between him and the Jews, and they're really theological, centering around the doctrine of the resurrection. Remember, the Sanhedrin is made up partially of Pharisee, partially of Sadducee, And so Paul is always mindful of his audience, and he is always, he speaks with great intelligence. He brings up the resurrection of the dead because he knows he's going to gain the favor of the Pharisees, and he's going to turn the Sadducees against him, and he's going to turn them against each other and take all the focus and so much heat off of himself. So with the nod of his head, Felix invites Paul to speak for himself. Paul responds to Felix in a lot different, in sharp contrast, I guess, than the flattering introduction that Tertullus opened with. Paul just simply recognizes that Felix has had several years of experience in Jewish matters as the governor of Judea. So he's glad to appear to somebody that knows about Jewish religion, knows about Jewish customs and its problems. So Paul states that he came to Jerusalem for the purpose of lawful business. He said in verse 11, I came to worship the Lord. And then he said, I brought money to the saints. Remember when Paul came back, he brought money from the churches to the poor churches that were in Jerusalem. And then he said, I've only been in Jerusalem for 12 days. And he said several of which he had been in Roman custody. So he hadn't really even had time to cause a ruckus or an insurrection. And at least not in Jerusalem. So none of his accusers that are there can prove in any way that he's disrupted the peace. And on this particular visit to Jerusalem, he didn't preach or evangelize to anybody. So Paul gladly identifies himself as a worshiper of God, the God of his fathers. And as a Christian, Paul believes that he rightly worships the God of Israel. And for him, there is an essential unity between the Old Testament and the Christian faith. The law and the prophets find their fulfillment in the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So believing the law and the prophets, like the Pharisees, Paul has hope in the resurrection and the judgment, both of the wicked and the righteous. Verse number 15. So the biblical doctrine of the resurrection not only includes the hope of a final transformation, renewal, and blessedness, but also the expectation of a final judgment. So by implication, Paul aligns himself with the Pharisees again because they believe the same thing, and which is against the Sadducees. So as Paul continues his defense, he mentions the number of years that had lapsed since he had been at Jerusalem. A lot of time had lapsed in verse number 17. And I came back bringing alms to my nation. So Paul said, I didn't come with no ill intent. I didn't come to cause no problems. So he continues, and Paul had brought a substantial sum of money to the poor Christians at Jerusalem, collected from the Gentile churches as a token of their love and their expression of unity. And while he was in Jerusalem, he's presented offerings, referring to, remember back in chapter 21, the 4 men that James suggested that he paid for their purification ritual that they were going through. Paul brings that up, and so they could complete their Nazirite vow. And on that occasion, these Asian Jews found him in the temple after he had completed the ritual of purification. So in verses 18 and 19, he said, these Jews found me. When they found me, I wasn't doing nothing wrong. Actually, I was in a state of purification. I was actually keeping Jewish custom. I was actually doing the things that a good Jew would be doing. I wasn't causing no problems. So Paul is bringing this incident up to refute the charge against him that they said that he profaned the temple. So when the Jews from Asia came up, he was ceremonially clean. So contrary to what they were saying, that he had profaned the temple, Paul's saying they actually found me in a holy state. They actually found me purer than they would any other time. So he's quietly attending the ritual purification. He wasn't causing a disturbance, wasn't gathering people around him. So the implication that Paul is given is that the Jews from Asia was really the ones disturbing the peace. So let's look at verse 19. who ought to have been here before thee, and object if they had aught against me. He's talking about these Jews from Asia. See, they wasn't there. Tertullus came up with the Sanhedrin, but the actual accusers did not come to Caesarea. And if you brought accusations against a Roman citizen, you better have proof, because you could be in much trouble as them if you didn't have proof of your accusation. Verse 20. Or let these same hearsay, if they have found any evil doing in me while I stood before the council, except it be for this one voice, I cried standing among them, touching the resurrection of the dead, am I called in question to this day. So certain Jews from Asia had claimed to be eyewitnesses and supposed that Paul had committed a crime of desecrating the temple, but they're not in court today. And Paul's conclusion, therefore, is, knowing Roman law, that if my accusers are not here, then there's no charges. There's nobody here to accuse me. Paul was very intelligent, very smart in the law. He knew what he was, and so he was as smart or smarter than those he was sitting under. So nobody has any evidence of Paul committing a crime. Kind of like this made-up junk that they've tried to bring against the former president. They've tried everything in the book, but nothing sticks. Why? Because most of it's a bunch of lies. Amen. So even Ananias and his delegation couldn't have found him guilty of any charge. That's why they brought Tertullus, so he could speak big words and make it, when you go into court, you almost know that one side or the other ain't got a foot to stand on, because it's just a bunch of fluff and stuff. And that's what Tertullus is trying to do, is he's trying every way in the world to pull anything that he can just to make it look like that they've got some kind of proof of their accusations. But Paul said it's concerning the resurrection of the dead. That's why that I'm here today in verse 21. Well, that was no crime, but Ananias and his Sadducee friends resented the Pharisaic confession of the belief in the resurrection. So the result was a fierce quarrel between the Pharisees and the Sadducees in the council. So basically, at the heart of the dispute between Paul and the Jews is the conflict over the interpretation of Scripture, focusing on the question of the resurrection. So when you think about it, why should Paul be judged on a doctrinal matter that the Sanhedrin has already divided themselves on and fighting about? It's outside Roman authority to deal with theological issues and condemn a man for heresy. So this didn't even belong in a Roman court of law. But Paul's detained in custody even after his testimony. Verse 22. And when Felix heard these things, having more perfect knowledge of that way, he deferred them. I like that statement there. We'll go back to it here in just a second. When Felix heard these things, having more perfect knowledge of that way, he deferred them and said, when Lysias the chief captain shall come down, I will know the uttermost of your matter. And he commanded the centurion to keep Paul, and to let him have liberty, and that he should forbid none of his acquaintance to minister or come unto him. And after certain days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, which was a Jewess, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning faith in Christ. And as he reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, Felix trembled and answered, go thy way for this time. When I have a convenient season, I'll call for you. He hoped also that money should have been given him of Paul, that he might loose him. Wherefore he sent for him the oftener and communed with him. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room, and Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound. So Felix defers Paul's case and don't make a decision. The decision is not uninformed, because verse 22 there that we read says, Felix having more perfect knowledge of that way. He's not deceived by Ananias and his delegation. Felix knows this is all just a hoax. He knows they're wrong, because he's familiar of the way. He's familiar with Christ. He's familiar with this story of the resurrection. He's familiar with the preaching. He's familiar with the Jews. So he knows more than what they think he knows. They're trying to pull one over him, but he knows. But he still does nothing about it. Because here's his problem. He wants to stay in good with the Jews because he wants to be elected again. He wants to stay in rule. He wants to stay in power. So he's got a problem here. He wants to do Paul a justice. He ain't got no reason to keep him. If Paul slip him a little money, if he'd pay a little bail money, I'd let him out of here. Paul ain't paying no bail money, and him innocent. So he detains him. Felix keeps him. Even though he keeps him, he allows his friends and allows him to have visitors and things to come. Had Felix dismissed the charges, it would have caused a problem with him between the Jews. So he postpones Paul's judgment. The motive ascribed to him adjourning the proceedings without decision is twofold. First of all, he has an accurate understanding of the Christian movement. How that he got this information, we're not exactly for sure. But it is the possibility that his wife Drusilla may have been his source. But the governor had been in Judea long enough to learn about the religious parties that these that are before him are divided into, and knowing what the Christians believe. And as Luke's account stands here in the book of Acts, Felix seems to be sympathetic toward the Christians, not wanting them to be mistreated by the Jews. But his later behavior reveals that he's unwilling to treat them justly so that he could get on the good side of the Jewish authorities. Second, Felix wants to confer with Lysias before he makes a decision. Well, that's pretty wise. That's pretty smart. So the guard that did not come down, Lysias, that saved Paul's life, he did not come to Caesarea to make testimony. So he says that when he comes, I'll see what he has to say, and that will help me make a better determination of your charges. So it may have been the intent to get more details about the case from this Roman commander, but there's no evidence that the governor sent for Lysias or sought his advice. It never says that he sent and actually called for Lysias. So the decision to postpone the sentence implies that he's convinced, apparently, Paul's innocent. But Felix don't want to release him as he should have, just like Pilate should have released Christ. So he don't release Paul, but he does at least treat him as a Roman citizen, because he has to, because he's not been proven of any crime. As a prisoner, Paul would enjoy a measure of freedom. He's allowed to have visitors, he's allowed to have friends and medical attention. The Christian and others that live in Caesarea can come and visit him and bring him food and letters and writing material. The humane treatment that Paul receives reveals where Felix's sympathies are. So he ain't no count, but he is sympathetic of Paul because he allows him freedom that others maybe would not have. But after the trial is postponed and ends, Felix leaves Caesarea. And when he returns, he brings his wife Drusilla to the city. Who is Drusilla? Well, Drusilla is actually the youngest daughter of King Herod Agrippa, who at the age of 14 married Aziz, the king of a small Syrian state of Emesa. 2 years later, she was induced by Felix to abandon her first husband, and the governor brings Paul from prison so that he and Drusilla, his wife, can hear him as well and listen to what the Christian missionary has to say about believing in Christ. Verse 24. So Paul has been the defender, now becomes the preacher. And it tells us there that he preaches righteousness, temperance, judgment to come. He addresses these issues. Luke don't give us the sermon outline, but or he don't give us the sermon. He gives us the sermon outline, what the sermon contained. The governor has enough conscience that when he hears Paul preach, And he preaches about temperance, and he preaches about judgment, he preaches about righteousness. He has enough conscience left that it strikes fear in his heart. Felix is terrified at the possibility of judgment. Notice verse number 25. And as Paul's preaching and he's reasoning of righteousness, temperance, judgment to come, Felix trembled. Paul's the prisoner. Paul should have been the one trembling. But Paul is speaking the truth. He's speaking the gospel. And Felix is trembling. So, when he hears about the prospect of judgment, he trembles, he's afraid, but he smothers his conscience and fails to believe the gospel and the free offering of the forgiveness of sin. How genuine was Felix's interest in the gospel? Well, we really don't know. But he don't really seem to possess a deep interest, because he never furthers it. He appears to have a superficial interest because he calls the teaching of the Christians strange teachings. They're strange to him. But the message that he and Drusilla have heard is far from superficial. It's been a stirring message, and he wants to hear more of it. So with haste, he sends Paul away because it's getting too hot for him. So he said, I want you to go, and at a convenient time, I'll call for you. We'll hear you of this again. It's like the sinner on Sunday morning sitting in the church pew and they feeling the conviction of the Lord. They want to go ahead and get out. We'll think about this later. So Felix he's been moved by the words of the apostle. The whole situation of the injustice, the fake accusations, the made-up accusations that was brought against Paul, and then Paul standing his ground, defending the gospel of Jesus Christ, believing in the prophets. And Felix knows something in his heart. He knows what Paul is speaking is truth. But he's just not able to make that change. So Felix continues to have frequent interviews with Paul, but because of genuine interest in the Christian of faith, hears him at different times. It says that he sent for him the oftener and communed with him. So I think he had several conversations with the Apostle Paul. He hopes Paul will take the hint and that he will offer him some money for his release. That's what he's talking about when he says that he hoped money should have been given him of Paul that he might loose him. He was hoping that Paul would offer to give him bail money. At his trial, Paul reported that he had brought money from the Gentiles to help the poor Christians and had paid for purification expenses for men. So Felix hopes that this televangelist will raise enough money to go his bail to help get him out of here, and he can set him free. And that way he'd have a reason to set him free. I didn't set him free. The man paid his bail. You see, he could get out of that pernicious situation that he's in. But Roman law prohibited bribery. But it wasn't uncommon for Roman officials to receive bribes. But Paul don't take no part in such a crime. Verse 27 says, after 2 years. I don't know. That just don't seem fair for somebody that ain't guilty of anything. Paul spends 2 years in Caesarea. Festus succeeds Felix as governor of Judea. During the 2 year, Paul remains a prisoner because Felix wants to win the favor of the Jews and maintain his position as governor. To avoid antagonizing them further, he's willing to sacrifice an innocent man, but he don't succeed in his effort to remain governor. They kick him out. When he eventually does return to Rome, the Emperor Nero replaces him with Festus. And that's where we'll pick up next time in chapter 25. Festus comes from Caesarea to Jerusalem, and we'll see that he is a Jew pleaser as well as an attempt to conciliate a people that is very difficult to govern. He's a little better person than Felix, but we're going to see the same thing continue to play out. The Jews, the Sanhedrin, are still trying to convince even Festus, bring him down, let us judge him. They're still wanting to plot to ambush him so that they can kill him. And so Festus asked Paul, will you not go up to Jerusalem? Let's just go to Jerusalem, have this trial in Jerusalem. Paul said, I ain't done anything wrong. I appeal to Caesar. Festus said, once he appealed to Caesar, wasn't nothing. It's out of Festus's hand. He has no more authority. So that's where we pick up in chapter 25. Interesting chapter, I thought.
It's all politics. Yep.
It remains the same.
It's so